We have breaking news right now. Two fighter jets have just been scrambled to investigate an unresponsive plane over the Atlantic Ocean. The Cicada TBM 700 light business and utility aircraft, like this one you see here, departed from Rochester, New York just this morning. Its flight plan had it bound for Naples, Florida. The passengers on board haven't responded to several attempts to communicate. Both NORAD and the FAA are now keeping an eye on this situation. We're going to bring you more as soon as it comes in. And we have breaking news right now. Two fighter jets have just been scrambled to investigate an unresponsive plane over the Atlantic Ocean. That plane is the Cicada TBM 700. Like this one, I think we have an image of it here we can pull up. It was departing Rochester, New York earlier this morning, bound for Naples, Florida. So far, the passengers on board that plane have not been responding to attempts to communicate. NORAD is continuing to monitor this situation, and the FAA is also keeping an eye. We're going to be bringing you more as soon as we get it. In the meantime, we have Jim Tillman, aviation expert, on the line right now. Jim, do we have you on the phone?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So what can you tell us about this situation? What kind of a jet is this, first of all, and what are its typical applications?
If it's the same airplane that you have shown on air, it's not really pure jet. It's more of a turboprop aircraft, single engine. And
so what kind of passengers would be on board this aircraft typically?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It would be business passengers, whatever else. It's not really a commercial airplane in the greatest sense of the word. Not that it's not used for commercial purposes from time to time. It's just not a large airplane in terms of the way that most passengers like to think in terms of a commercial airplane. It's relatively small in comparison with what people fly on from point A to B.
And Jim, potentially how many people are on board this aircraft?
Well, I haven't looked at this version of it in a while, but it looks to be something like 10 or 12 passengers or in that range, maybe a little bit more. But it's not, you know, it's not like a 737 or a 777 or whatever else. It's a small airplane.
Jim, so we know that two F-15s are flying with the plane east of Florida. The windows are apparently frosted. It's unknown how much fuel is left. NORAD's been in touch with Cuban authorities via the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. military jets are, of course, not going to enter Cuban airspace. That's what NORAD is telling us just this moment over the wires. But Jim, tell us, what kind of circumstances could have led to this unresponsiveness? Are there innocent explanations that could be at play here?
Well, the key operative that you mentioned was that the windows are frosted. If the windows are frosted, it gives rise to the idea that they may very well have lost pressurization, and that means that they were literally going to sleep in hypoxia. Now, this has happened before a few times across the United States, where we've had airplanes that the pilot and crew and all have not had adequate pressurization for whatever reason. And what happens is you get hypoxia, and the thing about hypoxia is it very slowly and very silently begins to take your ability to reason away, and the next thing you know, you go to sleep and you don't wake up. And if that's the case, no one on that airplane is awake, and that means it's an airplane that's flying solo without anybody at the controls that's able to make any changes.
And in fact, Jim, mirroring exactly what you just said, NORAD has just asserted on Twitter that this may involve hypoxia, just as you're speculating. So a lot of souls potentially in jeopardy here. What is the next step for NORAD and the FAA in a case like this?
I don't know what their policies are at this moment, but there's not a whole lot they can do. The airplanes are not a threat to anybody. I mean, it'll eventually run out of fuel, and it'll crash as a result of nobody at the controls. I don't know if NORAD has a procedure that if they see this airplane's about to enter airspace it's not supposed to be in, to shoot it down or not. I don't know. It sounds like there's nobody on that airplane that's alive. At least that's the way it sounds. If that's the case, it's a decision that's made out of the protocol of NORAD, and I'm not privy to that information.
And we're about to show the audience the flight aware track for that plane. We have more information coming in every second on this. Jim, you mentioned that there's a chance this plane could just go down of its own accord. Could that happen over land, potentially in a populated space?
It could happen anywhere. There's no one there's no way to predict necessarily where it would happen. If he's out over the ocean, he's likely to stay over the ocean and at all. I don't know its exact direction or the exact heading from where he is right now, and whether or not in the next hour or so that would take him overland someplace. It's a matter of trying to figure out how much fuel he had on board at the time that he took off, and how much of that may very well have been exhausted over this period of time, and then the rest of it's just a matter of...
And Jim, I'm going to ask you to hold that thought for a second there. We have more breaking news now. NORAD, just this moment, tweeting that the unresponsive aircraft has entered Cuban airspace. NORAD fighters have therefore had to break off their trail of that aircraft. What does that mean for the fate of any potential passengers on this flight, if there are any still surviving?
Well, I don't know what the Cuban government would do under these circumstances. If they really are thinking realistically, they'll know that the airplane poses absolutely no threat to anybody in Cuba. I mean, it's unless it runs out of fuel right over the island and crashes into Cuba. I have the feeling, and I don't know the altitude of the airplane and that sort of thing, and I also obviously don't know how much fuel he's got, but he'd probably overfly Cuba and go right on over the ocean again. That's just speculation. I don't know the heading of the airplane, and I don't know its altitude, but that's what I would suspect. He certainly doesn't pose any threat to anybody, except in the unlikely event that he would crash into something that was populated.
Jim, stick around. We are joined right now on the phone, I believe, by Jim Kavanaugh. He's a former special agent with the ATF. Jim Kavanaugh, should we suspect links to terrorist activity here based on what you're seeing?
Not at this point, Ronan, because these light aircraft, really would have to have a pretty good payload of explosives on board to make it any kind of a terrorist thing. And of course, the travel to Cuba does not necessarily indicate any, strike against the continental U.S. So probably, we had one a few weeks ago where the pilot was unresponsive and crashed in the Atlantic. So this could be a medical emergency, or certainly could be some kind of hijack situation, but it may be not a terrorist situation. Of course, this is private aviation or smaller aviation, not large commercial aviation. So there's a difference.
And Jim Kavanaugh, what options are available for dealing with this situation now that this aircraft has entered Cuban airspace?
Yeah, it's going to be really up to the Cuban government, Cuban military probably, to see what they're going to do with it. Shortly, I could probably overfly Cuba if they let it go. And if we see it go south into the, the greater Caribbean Ocean down there towards South America, that'll be an indication that maybe the pilot is totally unresponsive medically or passed away or somehow injured. I don't think Cuba will necessarily try to shoot it down since it's such a small aircraft, but they'll certainly be monitoring it very closely. Of course, the other factor, Ronan, is it could try to land in Cuba, and somebody could have tried to hijack the small plane to get to Cuba.
Jim Tillman, do you think that the fact that it has diverted into Cuban airspace suggests that that's a real credible possibility?
No, I really don't think that. If you had not told me that the windows were frosted over, I would think of a lot of different possibilities. But really, the thing that is generally associated with incapacitated crew is the kind of thing you have described, because the windows will frost over if you don't have adequate pressurization and air, breathable air in that airplane. And then, of course, the likelihood that you can survive that is pretty slim. I mean, it's a matter of minutes before you begin to go to sleep.
We have a statement in just now from the FAA. They say Federal Aviation Administration air traffic controllers are tracking a Cicada TBM 700 aircraft flying at an altitude of 25,000 feet southbound off the Florida coast over the Atlantic Ocean. The pilot has not been responding to radio calls since 10 a.m. Eastern time. The flight departed from Greater Rochester International Airport in New York and was headed to Naples Municipal Airport in Florida. And again, the latest reporting we have is that NORAD has tweeted that the windows are in fact frosted over, which our experts are saying suggests hypoxia and is an ill omen perhaps for passengers on that jet. Jim Tillman, based on the capacity fuel-wise of this aircraft, how long could it continue flying unattended?
Well, that's a question I can't answer because I don't know how much of a load he took when he took off. Obviously, it was adequate to go and land at his destination, but he's overflown that by quite a little bit so far. It's impossible for me to know that. I would say, however, that it's highly possible that that airplane will just continue right across Cuban airspace and over the ocean again. And then, of course, it's up to a lot of speculation or whatever else about how soon it will run out of fuel.
All right, thank you, Jim Tillman and Jim Kavanaugh. We're following this breaking news situation again for everybody at home. Fighter jets dispatched by the NORAD forces as well as the FAA, a fighter that appears to have frosted windows, suggesting that there may be a hypoxia situation and that the passengers on board are not responsive. Certainly they are not getting a response from the cockpit of that aircraft right now. I'm going to bring in Jay Blackman. He's an NBC producer who follows aviation issues very closely. Jay, what does the current fact pattern suggest to you?
Well, if the pilot has been unresponsive since 10 a.m., you're looking at, almost 3.5 hours. The possibilities are many. The pilot could have had a medical emergency. It's not clear how many people are on board. Hypoxia happens when a plane loses pressurization at altitude. If you don't go into oxygen, you very quickly become unresponsive. This is similar to an incident that happened that killed golfer Payne Stewart back in the 90s, where the plane flew and flew and flew until it finally crashed into a farm field. As I think you've reported, the fighters have broken off since they've entered Cuban airspace. And as Jim Tillman said earlier, Ronan, this plane had enough fuel to get to Florida, and pilots always budget extra fuel in case of having to make an alternate landing or weather and having to fly around that. But it is getting to the tail end of its fuel tank.
And how common, you mentioned this one previous high-profile instance, but how common is this kind of a depressurization and then subsequent lack of oxygen?
It's not uncommon, but it's not very common. You don't often hear of hypoxia incidents. In commercial airliners, you don't hear of them very often either. If you realize that you're having a pressurization problem, if you can bring the plane below 10,000 feet, it becomes breathable air. The plane is not at a significant high level of pressurization. Often you will hear of pressurization problems in commercial airlines, and they just bring the plane down quickly, and the passengers are completely fine. What happens in hypoxia, though, is that before you pass out, it becomes difficult to think. So that can be a big issue. But again, you don't know what's happened here, and what will be interesting to find out is if when the fighters were up there, they saw. If they did in fact see icing on the windshield, that would lead one to believe that there was a pressurization issue.
And that is in fact the reporting we're receiving now. We're going to be working on confirming that. Thank you so much, Jay Blackman, and thank you to all of our guests. We're going to be following this breaking news very, very closely. Again, a small aircraft over the Atlantic Ocean, signs of potential depressurization and a lack of oxygen. Our thoughts are with those passengers. We're going to have much more up ahead. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're following breaking news right now. We have fighter jets dispatched by NORAD following a small aircraft over the Atlantic Ocean that has been unresponsive since 10 a.m. Eastern Time, according to the FAA, which is also following this situation. NORAD reported on Twitter that people on the plane haven't responded to any attempts to communicate and said the situation may involve hypoxia. That's a low level of oxygen after depressurization. A tweet from NORAD just moments ago says unresponsive aircraft has also entered Cuban airspace. NORAD fighters have therefore broken off their trail, but we are continuing to follow that flight path. You see the image there. Greg Fife is with me now on the phone. He's a former NTSB investigator. Greg, what comes next in the response from these aerospace organizations that are following this plane? How do they deal with this issue of this plane being apparently over Cuba from the images we're seeing now?
really the big thing now is just wait and see. They really can't do anything. In this post-9/11 era, of course, there's always been the discussion about whether or not this aircraft poses a threat. And if it continues, if it has enough fuel to continue over at least the Cuban mainland and get back out over the ocean, they may just follow it then and wait for it to run out of gas, like we've seen in other aircraft, like Payne Stewart, the famous golfer who was involved with the Learjet, whose crew suffered hypoxia. And in fact, there was a similar event just last week with a Cirrus SR-22 that was supposed to land at Manassas, Virginia, and failed to land. They scrambled fighters and actually followed the airplane till it ran out of gas near Chincoteague Island in Virginia and crashed into the ocean.
And you mentioned other types of small planes that have encountered this same kind of problem. This particular aircraft is reported to be a Cicada TBM 700. It took off from Rochester, New York this morning. It was bound for Naples, Florida. When you look at that particular type of aircraft, Greg, how long could this craft potentially fly unattended?
Well, with it depending on the number of passengers that are on the aircraft and baggage, because you're going to determine your fuel load based on weight and balance. So, given the fact that they were going Rochester to Naples basically nonstop, it would indicate to me that he probably had, or she, we don't know who the pilot is, may have had pretty much a full load of fuel. And this aircraft, again, not knowing the winds aloft and those things, the airplane could continue conceivably for another 30 to 60 minutes. I mean, maybe even longer. And again, it all depends on what kind of atmospheric conditions the airplane is encountering at 25,000 feet.
And we have a new piece of information just coming in over the wires. U.S. officials telling NBC News that the two F-15 Air Force planes that had been shadowing this small commercial plane that was showing an unresponsive pilot, it seems looking through these windows that they're frosted and the passengers are also unresponsive, that those planes following this have now broken off contact and are no longer following it due to this issue of it being in Cuban airspace at this point. According to those officials, the Air Force pilots could see the private pilot unconscious and slumped over inside the cockpit. That is the latest information we have. The officials are telling us at NBC News that the plane is flying at 25,000 feet, which is an altitude considered unusual at this point for that type of small commercial aircraft. Again, a Cicada PBM 700. It's unclear if or why the pilot would have set the autopilot at 25,000 feet. Greg, what does it suggest to you that the autopilot did in fact set that height?
Well, I'm not sure where you're getting that information. This is a single-engine turbo.
That is the latest from our Pentagon correspondent, and he is being told this information from U.S. officials.
Okay, well, that's incorrect, because this airplane being a single-engine turbo propeller airplane, it has a turbine engine on it, and typically it can fly in the 20,000-foot range, and that would be basically a normal altitude for this type of aircraft. Other airplanes that are equipped with reciprocating engines wouldn't normally be that high. But this is a turboprop. That would be a normal altitude for this type of airplane.
Okay, so potentially 25,000 feet, actually a normal altitude. We'll be following up on that and watching it closely. The other contentious issue here, of course, whether they saw frost on these windows, which would suggest hypoxia. That is not something that the officials that we're talking to could confirm at this point. We're also not able to confirm the number of passengers on this plane. That is something the FAA manifest would tell us. We have Jim Miklaszewski with us right now at the Pentagon. Of course, our Pentagon correspondent. He's following this and the U.S. response to this very closely. Jim, tell us the latest that you know.
Well, the latest that we know is that U.S. officials tell us that those two U.S. Air Force F-15s that had been shadowing this aircraft with its unresponsive pilot and crew has now broken off contact, that those two jets have peeled away. They're no longer following this airplane because it, in fact, was approaching and had entered Cuban airspace. So at this point, whatever radars may be tracking it, the U.S. Air Force pilots no longer have eyes on that aircraft.
Jim, what does this challenge of it entering Cuban airspace trigger in terms of the reaction from the Pentagon? What's the procedure? Do you think high-level conversations are now happening with the Cubans?
Well, if there were high-level conversations underway, perhaps they would have not had to break off, but they're not allowed to enter Cuban airspace, so they broke off. We have no word that any kind of negotiations are underway, and quite frankly, when you think about it, think about how long that would take. It would probably take days. So that kind of thing would be futile at this point. And it's not like we have any kind of international agreements with Cuba in terms of flying military aircraft over that airspace. So they were forced to break off.
And Jim, what about this report that while those jets were shadowing this aircraft, they saw into the cockpit and saw that the pilot was slumped over and unresponsive?
They did see that he was slumped over, according to the officials we're talked to, which is a strong indication, obviously, of hypoxia. No idea, perhaps you know, but these officials had no clear idea how many other occupants were aboard the plane. There would have been an FAA manifest before it took off from Rochester, New York, en route originally towards Naples, Florida. But there are more people aboard that plane, we're told, than just the pilot himself.
And what is the continuing role of both NORAD and the FAA in following this situation, Jim?
Well, they'll continue to track it as best they can with whatever radars they have. But again, the two aircraft are no longer in sight of the plane with its unresponsive crew.
There are no reports that there's any sign of foul play or a terrorist threat here at this point. But, Jim, how much are you hearing concern about that possibility from the officials you're talking to?
None. Zero.
So this could be just a depressurization due to some kind of a mechanical failure. Obviously, our thoughts are with those passengers on board. But
Probably.
Right now, the Pentagon is not confronting what could be a threat to any Americans, for instance.
No, I mean, and unless you had a small plane like this loaded with explosives that flew into something, the idea that a plane with an unresponsive pilot, as it appears to be in this case, does not indicate or set off any alarm bells of a possible terrorist involvement.
And Jim, what would the standard procedure be if this were not a situation where this aircraft had entered Cuban airspace? Would this be standard procedure to just let the craft fly out its remaining fuel?
Well, if you think back to the Payne Stewart incident, when the famous golf pro who was killed some time ago in a what appears to be a similar situation where the crew and everybody on board went unconscious due to hypoxia, they were considering actually, as it was flying over populated areas of the United States, of actually having a jet slowly descend onto the plane and shove its nose down so that the plane would intentionally be forced to crash if, in fact, it was threatening a populated area. But at this point, since the U.S. military is no longer in contact, it appears that it will most likely have to run out of fuel and then just plunge out of the sky, whether over Cuba or into open waters is undetermined at this point.
NBC's Jim Miklaszewski following the latest in the U.S. response to this situation. Appreciate it, Jim.
All right.
We've got former NBC aviation correspondent on the line, Bob Hager. Thank you so much, Bob, for joining. Sure, first of all, tell us what comes next in the response, both from the U.S. side and from the Cubans now.
Well, I think, as others have said, there's not much to do now but just wait. It appears to be fairly straightforward, as everyone said. I mean, especially with the report that the pilots from the chase planes had seen the pilot of the private plane slumped over, seen the frosted windows, all that, clear sign that the oxygen system on board the plane had failed, that they'd run out of oxygen, and sadly the pilot and whoever else is on board passed out. No chance at that altitude that they would still be alive. So nothing to do but wait for it to run out of fuel and crash into the ocean.
Bob, if this plane does crash in Cuba, what's the next step in terms of recovering it? Will there be an effort to recover it?
Well, I assume then it would become a Cuban responsibility, and the Cubans would find the wreckage. And I said ocean. I mean, it could, in fact, crash over land. My hunch is it'll go over Cuba and crash into the ocean, given the fuel supply, but who knows. But if it crashed on land, it would probably be a Cuban responsibility. Again, fairly straightforward. Go search the wreckage and so forth, and then there would have to be an investigation, or it would be useful to know what it was that went wrong on the plane that caused this oxygen deprivation. But so far, it follows very closely, as others have said, the scenario of that Payne Stewart crash back in 1999, which I remember I covered. We were on the air all day that day because the plane was underway for 4 hours. You know, they take it off from Orlando, Florida, supposed to go to Dallas, and after they got up to altitude, nobody heard from them again. Again, like today, they sent up chase planes, fighter planes, to see what was going on. The pilots looked out. They could see the windows frosted. They could see, again, the pilot in that Payne Stewart plane slumped over the controls, no sign of life. So the plane flew on for some 4 hours before it finally crashed in a deserted field up in near Aberdeen, North Dakota. So this is all very similar to that. They did a big investigation after that. And I don't think it was ever absolutely determined, but it was something to do with the oxygen system on board the plane and using bleed air off the engines and the replenishment of the air in the plane, and something there had gone wrong, and the oxygen was allowed to bleed out of the plane. And that kind of unconsciousness comes over you very slowly as it happens. So often the crew is unable to respond.
Thank you so much, Bob. We've got Greg Feith still on the line. Greg, does the U.S. relationship with the Cuban government complicate efforts at recovery?
I think it does to an extent that, we're going to have to, because it is an unregistered aircraft, technically it is registered here in the United States. We always want to work with a foreign authority because it is not in the primacy rules of the NTSB. So you have to coordinate. And if the Cubans say, we don't have the resources, the manpower, the expertise, we'll allow you to investigate the accident, that agreement has to be hammered out before any action by the United States takes place.
Thank you so much. We've got on the phone now Ted Soliday. He's the executive director of the Naples Municipal Airport. Again, the flight path of this plane had it headed for that very airport. Tell me, Ted, when did you lose contact with the plane?
I have to tell you, I don't think they ever had contact with our airport or our tower. We heard first about it from the press that it was missing or it was destined here and was gone. Wasn't going to make it. But we now got it up on radar. But it's over Cuba, as you know yourself, and you really have the information we have.
And that is consistent with all the reporting we have, that this flight lost contact as early as 10 a.m. Eastern time, at which point these FAA aircraft were dispatched to follow it. Ted, tell us, do we know exactly how many people were on this flight? Have you looked at the manifest?
We don't have a manifest. Since it's a general aviation aircraft, it doesn't fly on a manifest like a commercial air carrier aircraft. And we did not have even an inbound information. They usually let us know a couple hours before they get here. We saw it as it was coming to Naples, but again, we didn't even show it had taken off when we started hearing the information from the press.
And do you know at least typically how many passengers a Cicada TBM 700 would have?
It's a 6-passenger aircraft counting the pilot. So it's a pretty small aircraft. It's a single engine. It is a very nice aircraft. It's a turboprop. It can go up to the 25,000 feet. It is pressurized. That's a nice little airplane, but I have no idea of who and how many or anything like that.
Ted Soliday, executive director of the Naples Municipal Airport, where this aircraft was headed. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you to all of our experts today. And thank you to you watching at home. We're following this situation. Breaking news, a small aircraft now entering Cuban airspace. Therefore, U.S. craft that have been following it have broken off their trailing efforts. We're going to be continuing to watch this story. Again, a small aircraft, up to 6 people on board potentially. Our thoughts are with those passengers. That wraps up today's RF Daily. Thank you for joining me. The Reed Report is up next.
Breaking news, mystery flight. Fighter jets scramble when there's no answer from a pilot midair. Plus this, to tail a small airplane when the pilot did not answer. The plane taking off from upstate New York, crashing near Jamaica. CBS 2's Dick Brennan live in our newsroom with more. Dick?
Well, Dana, as you said, the mystery flight had fighter jets scrambling. It carried the owner of a real estate firm, but it crashed after going way off course.
The plane, a Socata TBM 6-seater like this one, departed from Rochester, New York. On board, according to his son, was prominent developer Larry Glazer and his wife Jane. The plane was bound for Naples, Florida, but something happened that apparently incapacitated the passengers on board. The plane flew a ghostly 1,700-mile journey down the East Coast, the pilot unresponsive.
I'm working a oxygen system problem.
The plane was trailed much of the way by 2 U.S. F-15 fighter jets, and NORAD officials say they spotted a pilot slumped over in the cockpit.
I can see his chest rising and falling.
The windows then frosted over. The plane continued to fly out of U.S. airspace, and even the State Department got involved.
We have been in touch with the two countries over whose flight space it went through, the Bahamas and Cuba.
The plane eventually crashed into the Atlantic off the coast of Jamaica.
We hope everyone will have their thoughts and prayers with the Glazers at this difficult time, and that people will be able to and will respect their privacy.
Right now, it's not clear what caused the pilot to apparently lose consciousness.
He may have had a loss of pressurization. 25,000 feet, a single-engine aircraft. That's pretty tough.
Rick Glazer said that both his parents were licensed pilots. He said he can't confirm that they were killed, saying he knows very little, and it's not clear if there were other passengers on board. In the newsroom, Dick Brennan, CBS 2 News. Dana?
Thank you, Dick. New information at...
Much today, U.S. Air Force fighters scrambled to catch a private plane flying from upstate New York to Florida. The pilot wasn't talking to air traffic control, and now Jeff Pegues reports investigators think they know why.
The small private plane took off from Rochester, New York at 8:26 this morning, headed for Naples, Florida. But around 10 a.m., the pilot reported a problem.
We need to descend down to about 180. We have an indication it's not correct in the plane.
He was cleared to go to a lower altitude. Air traffic control never heard from the plane again.
900 Kilo November.
U.S. Air Defense was notified. Fighter jets were scrambled. They were able to see the pilot slumped over at the controls until the windshield frosted over, a telltale sign of cabin decompression.
Breathing. I can see his chest rising and falling. It may be a deal where, depending on how fast they descend, he may regain consciousness once the aircraft starts descending.
The plane flew in and out of Cuban airspace and at 2:15 p.m. crashed 14 miles north of Jamaica. On board the plane, real estate executive Larry Glazer and his wife Jane, who both love to fly. This is Jane in a 2013 interview.
We've been to Europe and Alaska, and it's just a fun thing that we share.
The incident is reminiscent of the 1999 crash of the private jet carrying champion golfer Payne Stewart. When the Learjet lost pressure, everyone on board passed out and died. Federal sources believe Larry Glazer was piloting that plane today. He was an experienced pilot who had purchased a new TBM 900 earlier this year. Scott, Larry Glazer and his wife Jane are now presumed dead.
The aircraft flew 1,700 miles before it ran out of fuel. Jeff, thanks very much. Today's jobs